Hello, art historians, and welcome to our lecture where we're going to be talking about another movement, although it's not an ism, in the modern art movement in Europe, which is going to be Art Nouveau. Okay, so let's kind of do a recap of how we have gotten to this point. So I want to take you back to pretty much everything from the start of the year, right? So really everything that we have covered that's been created as a work of art has been objective up until Unit 8, right? So what do I mean by objective is that the artists were creating an object. They weren't necessarily creating something that expressed their views or their feelings or their internal thoughts. It was objective. So even all the way back to Egypt, where seated scribe, they were painting an object that had, or creating, they were sculpting an object that had a function. And then you move forward and you go into, even Titian with the Venus of Urbino. He's painting a woman, all right, in a particular way. Like that's it. He's painting it still very objectively, where he's painting it how it looks. One of the things that just shook people up with Titian is that he chose to paint that object, all right? But then as we move into romanticism for the first time really started to show artists painting objectively. So they would paint an object, but they were painting it because they had feelings about it. They weren't painting the way that they felt about it necessarily, even though Turner is kind of an exception to that. But even the romanticists, they're still painting objects just with a particular agenda. So like Thomas Cole doing the oxbow, like that's a landscape. He's just imposing meaning on the landscape. But then as we start to move on and we get to Impressionism is really the last way that you can break down an object and show it. Like it's just basically broken down now into color with no drawing and just worried about how the eye sees it, and that's it. Once you hit Impressionism, you kind of go the opposite direction, where now in post-impressionism is the moment that art becomes very subjective. We are being subjected to artists who are going, look, I don't have to show the world as it looks. A camera can do that. We have broken it down to the smallest portion. It's time to move on. Post-impressionists use the world that we recognize. They'll still paint the world as we see it, but the way that they want to see it. So like Van Gogh saw it in energy and swirls and explosions of color. Cezanne sees it in geometric shapes. And then we get into symbolism, where these artists are subjecting us to what's going on inside their head and their thoughts, and then using the objective world so that we recognize that. So what we're looking at is art has become, with post-impressionism on, it's become very subjective, right? We're being subjective to the ideas of the artist about what art is or what is going on inside their mind. All right. So Art Nouveau is going to be a little bit of a continuation of this, and it is based on a belief and an idea. So this is going to be, since Art Nouveau, or the new art, you can tell that just like all these other art movements, it's going to get its kick up in France, because after Italy kind of stuck in Baroque, and France kind of picked up with the art movements of the time. Art Nouveau is going to become very popular in France and spread all over the world in the late 1890s, and is really going to be pretty popular until the end of World War I, until people just become very disenchanted after World War I. So it actually, the name comes from a shop in Paris, which I think is pretty cool, this Art Nouveau, or the new art shop. And Art Nouveau is not simply just an art, like painting movement. We're going to see Art Nouveau show up in everything, because it's a belief, it's an ideology that we're being subjected to by these artists, and they're going to impose it on everything. And these guys truly believe that we have gotten away from our connection with nature. Like we need to stop imitating the Greeks. We need to stop, reviving all of these styles, because we're basically just repeating ourselves. Let's go back to the time of nature and organic times, where it kind of just looks like this naturally just happened. So the context for this is really kind of a rebellion against the industrial age we were now living in, because really anything could be mass produced as art. Like even prints could be mass produced and sent out as art, or posters or whatever. And people, the Art Nouveau people, kind of believe that these works of art that are just being mass produced on a machine, they're not organic, they're not natural. They're, moving us away from our, relationship with nature that we had. These guys are so over the historical past. They're like, I'm done with that. I like natural. I want to go back to the times of organic, or, just coming from, it looks like it just grew there, or it just developed there, or it's naturally part of being there. So what these guys are doing is they kind of believe that all these machine made arts weren't really arts. They liked the craft, the natural, organic creating of things. And they believe that you could impose this on anything. So Art Nouveau is, you look at things and it's very nature based. So you see like flowers and vines and seaweed and oceans and things like that. So for example, this is in Vienna, Austria, which they really liked the Art Nouveau. And you can see here this is into a public bathroom, but the grates on the side that are that green, if you used some of these particular materials, they would oxidize and actually turn like this green, organic, natural color, like as they were naturally created to look. And you can see like these natural shapes and just kind of like they just developed. They weren't man-made by a machine. So when you're looking for Art Nouveau, I actually really do like Art Nouveau. I think it's really pretty and, just kind of a slap in the face to this industrial world we were living in at the time, and all of these, massive skyscrapers and steel and iron. It's okay, what if we could use that to still embrace the nature that we came from? Because we're moving away from that, we're actually destroying it. So they wanted to beautify this industrial world by embracing the natural world and natural shapes. And what's really cool is they actually really liked Islamic art, because remember, Islamic art wasn't figural, it was very decorative because they couldn't show images. So the organic patterns of Islamic tessellé and the mosaics, and it's something they really embraced. So when we're talking about Art Nouveau is not just painting, although there are Art Nouveau painters, but it's really a decorative style. And we see it in furniture, lamps, buildings, everything, like just this touch of Art Nouveau, bringing in organic elements, like things that just naturally grew and developed, like vines, snakes, flowers, things like that. So if you ever heard of like Tiffany lamps, like Tiffany lamps were a really good example of Art Nouveau. They were very, very expensive, but they really were responding to kind of this arts and crafts movement that was popular at the time, which was that these things need to be naturally made, not made by machines, but naturally made with the artistry that goes into creating it. And that's why things like Art Nouveau works of art are usually pretty expensive, because they are handmade and crafted, and the idea being that you're embracing these ideas of nature and organic, and they're very curvy and not symmetrical and very flowing, just like nature naturally does. Nature doesn't go in a straight line, neither does Art Nouveau. It's like, for example, a Tiffany lamp. I just think that's really pretty. Like it looks like it's actually organically grown out of it, like the base of the tree and then the lights and the hydrangeas. Just very pretty. So we're going to start Art Nouveau art by looking at another bridge artist. And remember, when I tell you about a bridge artist, they usually have 1 foot in one area and 1 foot in another. And we're going to start with Gustav Klimt, Klimt. And Gustav Klimt is a bridge between symbolism and Art Nouveau, because he's very much a symbolist in what he paints. Gustav Klimt was very into, a lot of his paintings actually were, considered to be too erotic, too sexual in nature to be shown. So there's a lot of them that I couldn't actually show. And he was a huge fan of Sigmund Freud. And remember, Sigmund Freud, if you've taken psychology, you've learned about the fact that Freud believed that everything that we do comes from our subconscious. And a lot of our subconscious had to do with the psychosexual stages we went through and we developed through, and that shaped our personality. So being that, he found a great deal of inspiration in Freud's ideas. So one of what we're seeing with Gustav Klimt is, this is actually called the kiss, all right? And he's subjecting us to what his idea of love is, all right? It's not a natural portrayal, a naturalistic portrayal. It's very, very symbolic. And what I mean by that is you have these two lovers who are so wrapped up in each other that they don't notice anything else around them. And it's almost like some people have actually considered this very hostile because it's almost like she's turning away and she's engrossed into this. And then there's people who say that symbolically they're on an edge of a cliff and they don't realize how perilously they're hanging over the edge because they're so wrapped up in love with each other. But either way, whenever Gustav Klimt would create these paintings from his gold series, as we call them, he would actually use gold leaf paint, like gold, pieces of little gold, pieces of silver, jewels that he would put in it. In fact, one of his paintings was one of the most expensive paintings ever created because it had gold and jewels and silver and diamonds on it. So, and you notice it's very organic in its patterns, very organic shapes. Everything kind of blends together. It looks kind of natural, but it is still very symbolic at the same time of what he's not painting a kiss, right? Just like Edvard Munch wasn't painting a scream. He's painting a subjected idea about what love is, just like Edvard Munch painted his anxiety and his stress. That's what he's showing here. And we have this, stay with me here, symbolic unity of male and female because the male has square symbols and the female has circle symbols on her to kind of show like the combination of the two. So Gustav Klimt is actually from Austria, and he led a movement called the Vienna Succession. And succession, if you think of it in that like what comes after, but like succeeding, like when the Civil War, when the South seceded away from the North, that's what these artists wanted. And being right next door to France, they would have very quickly picked up on this movement. But they wanted to create art in the way that they wanted to create it, because they'd kind of been following France's lead. So Gustav Klimt, who again, very into psychology, very into Freud, he had traveled actually to Venice and Ravenna, Italy, where he'd seen a great deal of Byzantine art and Islamic art. And he really liked the gold background of that and how it kind of, created this, beautiful Art Nouveau layout for him. And he liked the Islamic patterns and the mosaic patterns and things that he found. So he incorporates a lot of that in. You can see he's taking a lot of influence of almost mosaic in what he's creating. And you can see he's got circles and squares and shapes. But this painting right here was actually the most expensive painting sold in the world in 2006. And it was, millions of dollars. And not just because he did it, but because of what it was actually worth. Because of Art Nouveau and it being very decorative, he's putting all this gold and jewels and silver and things into it. So when Gustav Klimt did The Kiss, right, it is very, we talk about them not pulling from the past. Well, to them, they weren't actually pulling a historical style. They were just inspired by the natural style of Byzantine and Islamic mosaics and the gold background of it. And you can see that it's two-dimensional. It's very flattened. There's no perspective whatsoever. We can't tell if they're going into the distance. We can't tell if they're hanging off a cliff. And this one's actually just a remake of using cats, which I think is just really cute. I really want that painting for my house. But he's symbolic in what he's painting. He's painting the idea of love and what happens when we get so lost into it and how dangerous it can actually be. And because he was such a macho man, there's people who say, that it actually shows his view of love where a man basically encompasses the female, which is, not necessarily a good thing. But it is Art Nouveau also in the way that he made it with these beautiful gold, silver, jewels, these organic lines, just basically the way art was meant to be, just simple lines, simple shapes, very, plain in that design, but still very decorative. And this is the size of the kiss right here that you can see it. And he's signed it down here in the bottom. And you can see her feet are hanging off of something. So it may be this idea of instead of being in a field, it's this idea of how lost we become in love. And you just don't notice everything around you, including the dangers that you could be going into. So this work of art right here, I want to show you is called Red and White Plum Blossoms. And you can see here that this is also got some of that same look of Gustav Klimt. And it was an artist that very deeply influenced Gustav Klimt. And why do I include it? Well, one, it's on the 250, and two, it's because this work of art right here is from Japan. And I need you to still see that even with Art Nouveau, that idea of nature embracing that we see in Japan was still a big influence on the people of Art Nouveau. All right, so this is actually a work of art from Japan created by Ogata Koren. And Ogata Koren is a symbolist. He may not have known that, but the way that he was creating his art was very symbolist. And then the style, the way that he painted in a place that doesn't actually exist, it's imaginary. It's not something that he would have ever actually objectively seen to paint. It's an imagined place, was very like symbolic to him. So he's a Japanese artist who is known for screen paintings and fans. And he grew up in a family that was artists that made these beautiful screens, these and he actually helps create this new school of art and this new idea of design. But he liked to combine the unrealistic design with things from nature that could be recognized in order to make it symbolic. So kind of the way that Gauguin did and Gustav Klimt did. So to him, everything that he paints, just like in Who Are We, Where Are We Going, Where Do We Come From, everything that he paints is symbolic of something. And he uses the nature as a symbol, right? Which we're actually kind of seeing also with Klimt and these other artists. So one of the interesting things about Ogata Koren is he actually had grown up very, very wealthy. His family was well-known artists. They were calligraphers. They created these beautiful designs on kimonos, and he lost all of his money. But he still had a taste for the extravagant. So what we have right here is the gold background and the nature embracing and the organic forms, very, very symbolic and very, very influential on Gustav Klimt and other artists. But what this guy is doing with Ogata Koren is you see that he's actually taken copper paint and he has swirled it into this black river to show the swirling ebbs and flows of life. So, and that copper stands out against the black unknown, all right? So on the white and the red, you have the different stages of life. You have the mature plum blossoms and you have the young plum blossoms. And this river, which swirls and swirls and swirls as life does, then, and it's very metallic paint, so it really pops. It then starts to narrow as our life starts to end. So we have this moment of maturity in our life where we go from young to old. And then after that, our life starts to kind of narrow as we go towards aging. But during this time, we have all these swirls and, chaos and things that are going on. So this may have been his symbolic, painting of maturity from going from a youth to understanding, this world that he's living in. So the plum blossoms in Japan, they signify the coming of spring. So it's kind of like blossoming. So you've got a red plum tree, which is youth, and the white as we age. And you'll notice it goes backwards, kind of the same way that, Gauguin's does. And the stream, which is so wild and so wide, it starts to limit as we get older, our possibilities and our opportunities. So this is very, very symbolic, and it's done in the later years of his life. And you can see where this would also influence those Art Nouveau artists like Klimt, because he really liked that gold background, but the gold created a dream world, just like in the Byzantine where they use gold. It's kind of a heavenly background that we've never actually seen. It's a place to aspire to. Same thing with Ogata Koren, where it's kind of a dream world. It's making it very clear this is not a real place. This is not how rivers actually look. And you can definitely see in the swirls that he does that it's very influential on what Klimt does if you look at his works of art. But this place doesn't exist outside of his mind. It's not a real place. Just like that couple that Klimt was painting isn't a real person either. It's an idea of what love is. So this is actually two sides of a folding screen that Biombo folding screens in Japan, and it's the two sides of life. So you have youth and then you have the maturing, and it's kind of the two different, sides of our life. So this Rinpa movement that Ogata Koren started in Japan is very, very highly decorative because it's meant to be decorative in its style. You know, it's not meant to be naturalistic. It's meant to be pretty and using different colors that aren't naturalistic, like the copper, which is, you know, usually a decorative element in the water. Um, and another thing Japan was going through at the time is they were kind of trying to get back in touch with their nature-based roots because they've had all this influx of activity from the outside world. So this was a chance for them to kind of embrace with nature also in this industrial world. So we're seeing a parallel and an influence of what's going on in Japan on artists in Europe. We're seeing this mixing of the two worlds. But whereas Europe is feeling like they're moving forward and progressing, Japan is almost using it as a way to move backwards. And so we have to remember that this Japanese preoccupation with nature comes from the fact that they are an island. Like they are very, you know, succumb to nature, like they have to embrace nature. And that's also an idea that came from adopting Buddhism and from China and Taoism and those ideas in. So Japan's always had this very deep relationship with nature, and Europe is in their industrial age kind of trying to embrace that with Art Nouveau as well. Now, I do think it's really cool because this is one of the most popular paintings on the 250. A lot of people have seen The Great Wave before by Hokusai. And what's really kind of cool about this is this actually shows a transfer from Europe to Japan, that it wasn't a one-way street, that it wasn't just Japan that was influencing European artists, but that there are a lot of Japanese artists who are going to be embracing what's going on in Europe. So the first group of people that the Japanese, excuse me, would allow to trade with them because they weren't trying to religiously convert them was the Dutch. And the Dutch, if you remember looking at Vermeer, were very good at those because they were so involved in trade. They had access to some pretty incredible colors. And remember, Vermeer almost went broke trying to get his hands on these specific colors of blue. Well, this Great Wave by Hokusai has that deep Dutch blue in it, but it also, if you notice, has linear perspective. Hokusai actually studied European artists and their mastery of painting techniques to make his stuff look even more realistic, but it's still got that Japanese obsession with nature because what you're looking at here is two fishing boats who are caught in this wave, and it's showing that how powerful the water around Japan is and these waves crashing over them and their dependency on the sea to survive, but how that sea could take them out at any moment and how tall this wave is. But it's using linear perspective to do it because that's actually Mount Fuji in the background, and it's showing with perspective how big this wave is, that it's even bigger than the land. So this is actually probably one of the most copied works ever done in the world. In fact, a friend of mine had this tattooed on her foot because she was a biologist and she was very into nature, and she really, I mean, the whole thing's on her foot. It's insane. But this is an example of those woodblock prints that the Japanese would put out. But with Japanese woodblock prints, you can color them. So the whole idea of this is the Great Wave is part of a series. It's not just one painting. It's part of a series, and it's 36 views of Mount Fuji. And it's the idea of how important Mount Fuji is as a symbolic heart of Japan, that this volcano that can basically take them out at any time. But at the same time, it shows how powerful the sea is and the nature and how much that could take them out at the same time. And the people are so, so small. But it does have linear perspective in it. It shows that Hokusai was studying European artists and adopting some of their colors, like that Prussian blue that the Dutch were so obsessed with. So this is one of those examples of a ukiyo-e print, that idea of the floating world, and these prints that we saw from Japan that were so influential, that life is fleeting and life is very fast. And this one's got a little bit of a different message than some of the ones showing like sumo wrestling or bathers like we saw Mary Cassatt comping. This one instead is reaching out to the everyday person who could be affected by nature if the fish don't come in, or the fishermen, or, you know, if a volcano erupts. Whereas the other ukiyo-e prints that we saw that kind of influenced like Cassatt and Degas, those were more for the upper class of Japan. but this was really more for the everyday person and the life that they experienced. So this guy is not on the 250, but I do want to include him just because he's one of my favorites. And Art Nouveau is actually going to make its way all the way to Spain, where you have, I have to talk about him, I'm sorry, it's Antonio Gaudi, who is a Spanish architect who loved the Art Nouveau style and how organic and natural it was so much that he incorporated it into all his architecture. And his architecture is going to be an influence on American art architects who are going to see that buildings could be works of art themselves, not just, functional buildings. And he liked to believe that his buildings were living things that just kind of, grew out of the ground. So when you think organic, like it hasn't been messed with. It's just nature at its best, right? It hasn't been manipulated or used. It's just organic. Like it hasn't been chemically or, materially altered in any way. So this is Casa Mila in Barcelona, Spain, which looks like it organically grew out of the sand that is there. And actually, Barcelona had a great deal of beehives at the time, so it almost has like a honeycomb look to it. And you can see that even the grate on the balconies and on the doors, you can see here, look almost like seaweed, like they almost just kind of organically grew there and just developed into this building. This is another one. This is Casa Batlló, and you can see it almost looks like fish scales on the outside of it, fish or dragons. And then the inside, you can still continue to see that. And it almost looks like sand that's creating these little balconies on the outside. These are some of the other houses that Gaudi has done, very nature inspired. This is probably the most famous. This is Sagrada Familia, which is still not finished. They're still working on finishing this today. But he basically took the design of a Gothic cathedral and twisted it to turn it into these more organic shapes and forms. And this is actually standing in the nave looking upwards at the ceiling, and how it looks like you're basically just standing in something that looks like it grew out of nature, even with the colors involved. And you can see the outside looks like it's got leaves on it. It's almost like it grew there. Like it just grew and developed and became, instead of just being mass produced. This is another little village that Gaudi did in the inside of one of his houses. Even the banisters, just kind of wavy lines, very curvy. All right, so we are done with Art Nouveau, and we will finish with 19th century architecture next.